That's fine. Thank you.
Okay, well,
Добрый день.
Ready to
thank
start?
you.
Thank you.
So we have a good international group here. Washington, Montreal. Glenn, are you in Oslo now?
Yes, in Oslo.
Norway?
Yeah.
Okay. Virginia. Are you still part of the United States? Virginia.
For the time being, let's hope that doesn't last too much longer.
Okay, Peter is I'm missing. Oh, by the way, I want to also introduce someone from Ukraine, from Kyiv. Mila, are you here?
Yeah, I'm here. Thanks a lot.
Okay, very good.
Excellent.
So Mila is joining us from Kyiv, Ukraine.
That's
And
a
I
big one for me.
Good.
And Jeremy, you, what state you are now in?
I'm in Oklahoma.
Oklahoma. I think there was a famous movie, Oklahoma as it is, right? Something like that. It's
Very much.
Yeah,
Yes.
a famous musical, yeah.
okay. Let's move. I'm pleased that all of you are smiling, and not running away to bunkers and all that.
That's tomorrow, Ed.
So
Already in the bunker.
okay. Well, Putin just finished his press conference, and he was pretty encouraging. I mean, he made some strong statements, but in general, he thinks that the West is listening. So, well, I hope he's right. So let's do this. We don't want to spend too much time on kind of joking around. Let's each of us will do statements just saying where we are now, maybe what to expect, and then we'll maybe have some summary. Herbert Regenbogen, he had really family problem, emergency with his wife, so he couldn't join us, but he did send me something saying that what he thinks now is that maybe trying to get some religious leaders, since we were talking about end of the world.
That's a good point.
Sometimes Putin said some people will go to heaven, some people go to hell. So it's kind of a conversation like that requires maybe religion to step in. And he is now professor at the Catholic University, and he has some contacts with Vatican, and I know he's trying to arrange some dialogue between Catholic Church and Russian Orthodox Church, which I think why not? The only thing they should add some rabbis, take into account, who is involved in all this crisis. Maybe a couple of rabbis would be good if they join as well. But now it's free for all. Just raise your hand who wants to start, and then we'll move. Okay.
Okay,
Okay, Martin, let's go ahead.
I was afraid you were going to say that, Ed. I think I would quote a Habsburg Empire official towards the end of World War I in 1918, who said that the situation is desperate but not serious. We are in a very serious state. And in fact, if one looks at the situation objectively, it's extremely alarming. I think the two most reassuring aspects, which are interlinked, of course, are first of all, President Putin's continued, documented, and again, just most immediately stated comments of restraint. And I think it's hugely important, the tone in which he spoke. Putin understands and has always understood, and he's been a world leader for 20 years now, which of course gives him a perspective that Boris Johnson in Britain and American leaders completely lack, though I think Biden, at least having been vice president for 8 years, at least has a little of it. And that is the importance of maintaining dignity mutual respect in one's public tone, regardless of what is actually being negotiated or being offered on either side. But what we have here is a very asymmetrical relationship. Russia has put out very clearly what its stop lines are. It has drawn a line in the sand, but these are defensive lines. Russia has made clear that while it may seriously act even militarily under key circumstances, it does not wish to do so, and it is ready to stabilize the situation. This is very important and very positive, but this has not been met by equally dignified and responsive comments from the United States. To my mind, Secretary of State Blinken and National Security Advisor Sullivan in particular have failed to rise to the gravity of the occasion and grasp the importance of the issues involved. The United States is, and this is a bipartisan problem, and it is also a problem not just in the administration, but of course on both sides of Congress as well. We are so used to our salami tactics of advancing NATO forward, lecturing Central Europe and Eastern Europe on these nations and their internal affairs, that we don't know when to stop. We have no conception of stopping. In 1939, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, followed by Prime Minister Daladier of France, drew a line in the sand against Nazi Germany on Poland. It was extremely rash and idiotic of him to do so in the way that he did, because he was working overtime to rule out an alliance with the Soviet Union, which Joseph Stalin was very eager, in fact, to have with the West, and had tried in vain to have with the West for at least 5 years before the war began. We have new documentary evidence on this from Ivan Maysky's diaries, which have only emerged in the last 2 or 3 years, which confirms this. But by the time Chamberlain and Daladier gave their last warning to Hitler, they had no credibility with Hitler whatsoever. And Hitler misread them. He believed that since Britain and France had folded to Nazi aggression, and even in many respects actively encouraged it over the interwar years previously, this was just kabuki. It was a show. It was smoke and mirrors. But it was not smoke and mirrors. Chamberlain committed to going to war under the most unfavorable circumstances and tried to avoid war in a way that guaranteed war would come. We see a similar situation here now, except the line being drawn in the sand is being drawn by serious, responsible people, but they are again not being believed by the people who are the objective aggressors, which is NATO and the United States and the US European allies. And it is this lack of credibility, this lack of understanding in the American leadership and media, which makes the situation so dangerous, and which makes our own conversations, small number of us though we are, so important, because the mainstream American media lacks any awareness of the true issues here or the gravity of the issues that are involved. I do not believe we are actually on the very edge of World War III. I believe we could see one very easily in the next 2 or 3 or 4 years, all too easily. And even now, miscalculations could set off unlimited effects. We have just had reports that the United States is working with Ukrainian forces to set up Ukrainian guerrilla attacks on Russian forces if they occupy Donetsk, Lugansk, or any other area of Ukraine. A more stupid and irresponsible fantasy on behalf of American policymakers, and a more dangerous one, is extremely difficult to think of. So I think we are in a situation of great danger. It is not likely to explode immediately, but it is likely to continue deteriorating. And as these things go, it will deteriorate according to calculus. In other words, at a mathematically accelerating rate of speed. The deterioration will get worse, and it will get worse faster. And the greatest challenge we face, and it really is a mission impossible, but there is nobody else, I think, apart from us and our friends and colleagues to take it on, is to speak truth, not just to power, but to populace. and to try and make clear to the American people and to the American media what the true issues are, which they are willfully and deliberately in self-denial about.
Thank you, Martin. I think let's all keep the same time frame, short statement. Also, at the end, maybe someone will volunteer to have a summary. We are recording this, and my assistant Artyom, he's actually in Moscow. He will send everyone this YouTube, which is recorded, and we can come up with some kind of statement. And then my favorite newspaper, which Marty and I worked sometimes. It's probably the only paper. It's amazing. It's the only paper which allows a different opinion. And by the way, today it runs Matt Ehret and I put together an op-ed. I will send you a link. It's about Sakharov. Sakharov turns 100. It was this year, 2021. It's 100th anniversary, and this is a man who we need badly need. We need someone like Sakharov, who was trying to build a bridge between still the Soviet Union and then Russia and the United States. Unfortunately, we don't have too many Sakharovs around us, but we will try to do what we can. I suggest
you are Sakharov aide.
Well, I was his student, so
There you are.
we worked in the same university, right? He was professor at my university, which I teach right now. I suggest now we may switch to Oslo, because this is a place which we hear some rhetoric coming out,
Yes.
harsh rhetoric. So maybe Glenn will help us to understand where we're staying now.
Well, I guess the NATO Secretary General is Norwegian, so we have to take some of the blame here. In my opinion, I think that that we're moving again towards a very difficult situation, and I don't see any great possibility for any significant agreement. However, on an optimistic note, I have to add that at least they're having the right discussion, which is that this is a disagreement about what the leading principle of European security should be. And the fact that they're talking about what the principles of pan-European security should be suggests that at least, somewhat on the right track. So, but again, we have very different ideas, because in the United States, Washington insists that the main principle has to be that states should be allowed to freely choose their own security agreement or security arrangement. So Ukraine, in other words, should be free to join NATO. However, the US, you can say, is not too consistent with this, as it obviously openly aims to sabotage, CSTO, Eurasian Economic Union, and other Russian-led institutions. And as often pointed out, if China or Russia would develop military alliance with Mexico, one can assume that this principle would not stand that strong. But nonetheless, this is the main principle that they're advocating, that anyone should be allowed to join any alliance they want to. Russia's position is actually, in my opinion, very consistent with the pan-European security agreements we already have. From the first agreement in the Helsinki Accords with the inviolability of frontiers, which was then after the Cold War came to an end in 1989, it was expressed as indivisible security with the Charter of Paris of 1990, and then the Budapest document of 94, which established OSCE. So under this principle of indivisible security, the central or key principle in pan-European security should be that no state should strengthen their security at the expense of the security of other states. So, from this principle, NATO expansionism runs completely contradictory to the key principle of pan-European security. And this effort by NATO to replace indivisible security with the freedom to join NATO rests essentially on a key deception, which is that NATO rejects the principle of indivisible security by suggesting Russia should not be allowed to dictate to Ukraine what its foreign policy should be, hence contrasting, the freedom with the indivisible security. However, it must be pointed out that these agreements are not between Russia and Ukraine. In other words, Russia is not demanding guarantees from Ukraine that it will not accept membership. Rather, it's demanding guarantees from NATO that should not offer membership. And this is a very important distinction, because there's no inherent principle that NATO has to offer membership to anyone. However, by mixing up these two, the difference between offering or accepting membership, NATO can present, I guess, the conflict in a very different way. So this is no longer a conflict about NATO refusing to honor the commitments according to these pan-European security agreements. Instead, it's portrayed as Russia simply trying to establish a sphere of influence over Ukraine. So, so I guess that Russia's proposal, the way I see it, does not entail making Ukraine fall inside the Russian sphere of influence, which wouldn't be possible. I think it's about preventing then Ukraine from falling inside NATO's sphere of influence.
Exactly.
So I think from this perspective, if we're able to push all this hostile rhetoric aside, the whole conflict can be reduced to this very simple disagreement. Should the main principle of pan-European security be, the freedom to expand NATO, or should it be not to strengthen your security at the expense of the security of other states? Because all this other rhetoric about Russia trying to restore the Soviet Union or bring Ukraine into a sphere of influence, it seems to be very dishonest. And so again, I believe that it's positive that at least we're talking about pan-European security. Therefore, having some recognition that the era of simply expanding NATO and calling this European security has come to an end, and we have to discuss it. But the ability to reach an agreement between these two contrasting principles, I think, is going to be very difficult to do.
Okay, now we have someone who is responsible for that. It's Peter Kuznick, because he's in Washington. So we're now moving from Oslo to Washington. And Peter, you take responsibility for what Washington is doing.
I'm innocent of what I'm being accused of. When I was talking to Biden yesterday, I explained to him how dangerous the situation has become, but he told me to go fuck myself. He didn't want to listen. Where does one start? Martin and Glenn made a lot of the key points. I feel like we're preaching to the choir.
Yes.
I started this morning. I did an interview with Russia One already today. I've got an interview this afternoon with RTVI, I think is what it's called, another Russian net television channel, and I think another one also this afternoon. And to them, I give a different story that I'm going to tell to us, because we all know the history of this. We all know how dangerous it was that the West, especially the United States, broke its 1990 promise to Gorbachev, and what the consequences of that have been, expanding NATO 14 countries to the east. The thing that surprises me is that it's taken so long for Putin to finally say enough is enough. I go back to William Burns when he was U.S. ambassador to Russia in 2008, and the U.S. NATO talked about expanding to Ukraine and Georgia, and George Bush said publicly, we're going to expand NATO. And Burns, as U.S. ambassador, sent back a secret memo to Washington titled "Niet means Niet." Don't cross Russia's red lines. Take this seriously. But at that point, Russia did not have the military prowess to back that up. What's changed in the last couple of years is that Russia now militarily is confident enough, feels strong enough that they can take this kind of action and become assertive in ways that they wouldn't before. It was March 1st, 2008, when Putin gave his State of the Nation address and announced that Russia now has 5 new nuclear weapons, all of which can circumvent US missile defense. But since then, the situation has deteriorated. The US pulled out of more agreements. One of the points Putin keeps making is that the US can't be trusted because the US keeps on abrogating all of its commitments.
Exactly.
But then it's not only Putin who makes that point. The Iranians make it. Why? What is one of the big stumbling blocks of the JCPOA is that the US can't be trusted. Even if Biden makes a good faith deal about the nuclear issues with Iran, the next administration will very likely break that if it's a Republican
Exactly.
administration. So why should anybody have any trust right now in what the US is offering? So what Putin has been doing is building up, modernizing Russia's own military forces. And if we look at what he said in yesterday's talk to the military officials, you know, he talks about the fact that Russia's nuclear arsenal is what, 90%, or at least 70% fully modernized, much more than anybody else. The US is talking about nuclear modernization over a 30-year period. You know, but Russia's already done most of that. They've already modernized their military forces. They feel in a position to do this, but this is bringing out more insanity on both parts. For example, after the Biden-Putin phone call, before anybody had even gotten the gist of what had been said, Ronna McDaniel, the Republican National Committee chair, issues a statement, says Biden's weak leadership on the international stage has emboldened our enemies and shaken our allies' trust. While claiming to be tough on Russia, Biden gifted Putin the Russian Nord Stream 2 pipeline while simultaneously embarking on a job-killing crusade against U.S. energy industry. Today's meeting underscores how Biden's weak global leadership, Afghan disaster, and failure at our border is emblematic of the America last agenda. You know, so they didn't waste a minute before they started attacking him for just having that phone conversation with Putin. So what you see now with him and the Menendez hawks in the Democratic Party is bipartisan pressure on Biden to look as tough as he can in the aftermath of Afghanistan, which he obviously blew, the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And so that now that Russia is being assertive in a way that it hadn't been before, at the same time that NATO is being aggressive in ways that it hadn't been before, is creating a potentially disastrous situation. Now, we look at Biden's advisors. He brought in 16 members of the Center for New American Security. These are the Biden equivalent of the Project for a New American Century neoconish nuts who George W. Bush brought in.
Yes.
So he's surrounded with these militarists and these hawks who are looking for military solutions, or at least trying to assert America's unipolarity, which went out the window. Even Krauthammer acknowledged that back in 2006, that American unipolarity was a fantasy that he had been pushing. But the United States has not given that up. And the Europeans, you know, I'm glad to see that Scholz won, but the new foreign minister in Germany is a real anti-Russia hawk. And so, you know, we've been issuing threats, but we don't know what's going to happen. I was taken by Michael McFaul's tweet the other day. He said yesterday, I've listened to more Putin speeches than most. I've been in meetings with him for 5 years. This speech is something different. Putin's list of completely fabricated threats here is truly striking and scary. If he's trying to scare us by acting crazy, he's succeeding with me. So that's McFaul. You know, we all know what McFaul is and what he's represented. But what he thinks is crazy to us seems totally rational. But the point is that some of them are starting to get it, that Putin is talking in very, very different terms. And some people in Washington are waking up, but some are digging their heels. And I think of that lunatic, Roger Wicker, the Republican congressman from Mississippi, who said that maybe the United States needs to consider a nuclear first strike over this crisis in Ukraine. And so there are those crazies there who are still, and he's on the Armed Services Committee. So you put that in the context of, you know, what geostrategically Brzezinski and Hadley and Libby and Wolfowitz understood about wresting Ukraine away from the Russian orbit, how that would weaken Russia and prevent them from becoming a superpower again. So that is in terms of the long-term strategic interest. And then the other thing is the focus on China. So clearly the US want to get out of Afghanistan and shift from the Middle East because that's what they want to say. The Pentagon says China is our pacing threat, and that's where they really want to focus. So I don't think that Ukraine is their top priority. it's not nearly as important to the US as it is to Russia at this point. And so maybe there is room for negotiation. And I'm picking up some minor signs that maybe there is some reason going on and possibly some flexibility, and especially with this NATO expansion and further militarization of the conflict in Ukraine. So I am a little bit hopeful, but I am certainly not comfortable at a situation that could easily unravel into a military confrontation in which the US loses. And just like over Taiwan, does the US have a fallback other than using nuclear weapons? And from the issues that I deal with as a nuclear historian, that's what terrifies me the most. That the realization that Khrushchev and Kennedy came to in '62 was that any of these crises all these crises have to be eliminated, because once they start, there is no way to control them, and that they can all unravel out of control. And the American policymakers don't get that. And so I think we're in a very dangerous, precarious situation and have to take it as seriously as all of us are.
Okay, thank you, Peter. You mentioned at the beginning of some interviews you're giving to Russian TV. I don't think that American TV is interested in your opinion.
No,
I didn't see you lately on American TV.
you didn't catch me yesterday on CNN and MSNBC? Ed, you must still be watching Fox. That's why you didn't see that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that, well, I also am now banned because during the Soviet days, I was almost daily on all the major American networks, no more. But interestingly, yesterday, I was on Ukrainian TV, and so at least you see we have still some sensible people in Ukraine, and later on we will give a chance to the lady who will speak to us directly from Kyiv. Anyway, so now let's see. Let's go to Canada, because the Canadians are also playing very dangerous game. And so now, Matt, you are responsible for Canada. So
That's right.
You could tell us.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. It defies logic a little bit when you look at what is the governing sense of self-interest animating policy from any of the major rules-based, order-oriented states, Canada being no exception. I think that there is a certain degree of insanity that one has to factor into the equations here when you're dealing with where the world is going and what's shaping the conditions. There's a lot that's been said. I'm not myself an expert geopolitician or analyst. I'm a journalist who tries to stay abreast with things as best I can, and I'll sort of share some of my thoughts that came up just listening to the few presentations so far. I think context is everything, and looking at the world in terms of how it's shaping up. I mentioned insanity, but I think the cure for this type of insanity, which is holding on to a desire to hold on irrationally to an obsolete way of doing things that has no bearing upon how human society actually exists and thrives. The opportunity that we're losing right now, and we are losing a very big opportunity, is found in Russia and China. I mean, on December 15th, there was a very fruitful one-hour discussion between Putin and Xi Jinping. Coming out of it, there's obviously a commitment to, reinforcing the multipolar order that has really sprung to life in the past 6-7 years, and it's really taking on very creative evolutionary pathways. One of the leading assistants to Putin, the assistant on foreign affairs, Yuri Ushakov, he had mentioned that one of the points of focus is to creating a new financial architecture that is going to be accelerating. Already there has been an obvious de-dollarization that's been underway by a lot of the Eurasian powers. We know that there's been a lot of threats, not just for nuclear war, but also the nuclear financial threat that Victoria Nuland. We know that there's a variety of people from the rules-based orderista crowd that I mentioned who have been threatening to kick Russia out of SWIFT, the international payment system. So what we have seen is the Russian version and the Chinese versions of SWIFT that have come online over the past 6 years, the system for transferring of financial messages and the cross-border interbank payment system. One is Russian, one is Chinese. But again, these are ensuring trade in Russian rubles, in yuan. And I just loved how on December, I think it was the 8th or the 9th, or right in the midst of the big international democracy summit, where half of the world was not invited, you had Putin, who immediately took a surprise visit to visit Modi in India, where they signed a variety of memorandum of understanding with a key focus on trade, on defense cooperation. You know, the S-400s are also something India is seriously looking at. Nuclear power energy development, but also the international north-south transportation corridor, which has been an 19-year-old project to bring and enhance interconnectivity between Russia and Moscow all the way through to India, with something like 13 countries that have signed on to the memorandum of understanding, including Iran. So this is right there, and India was obviously one of the countries privileged enough to be invited to the Democracy Summit. So that was a really good statement of intention. We have the growth of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as a new security pact, which now has Iran as a full member, as well as India and Pakistan and many others. We have additionally Iran playing a big role. Is the I mean, there's a series of new agreements to build rail between Iran and Turkey and Georgia, as well as Azerbaijan. There's whole new grids of interconnectivity at the same time as there's the first rail being built as we speak, the Shalamshe to Basra rail between Iran and Iraq. It's a small rail, but it could easily extend through the remainder of Iraq and into Syria as part of a broader reconstruction for a southern gateway, a southern branch of the Belt and Road Initiative. There's already a middle corridor and a northern corridor, the northern going through Russia. But this would just be completely transformative. And it looks increasingly that this is where the wind is blowing. I mean, only one country in the Middle East, no, sorry, I mean, one Muslim country, Iraq, was invited to the Democracy Summit, and Israel, obviously, but nobody else was. There's talk of new trade zones led by Iran that are tied to the Eurasian Economic Union. That is what Russia is leading. That itself is already integrated very well into the Belt and Road Initiative. As of 2015, that process began, and now there's extensions into the Polar Silk Road in Russia. So we have this completely new financial architecture, this new paradigm of cooperation, win-win focus. And this is something which, under better times in the West, we were once also believers in. I'm thinking back to the time where John F. Kennedy went out to the United Nations a month before he was killed and made the call for cooperation with Russia in 1963, and I think it was October, calling for cooperation on a joint US-Russian space policy to jointly put a Russian and an American on the moon. That would have completely broken this this game theory, systems-based, rules-based thinking of zero-sum logic that defined the entire Cold War and is coming back in full hog right now. It would have completely broken those rules, and it would have created the basis of trust building and the creation of new economic relationships, which needs to happen if you're going to really have durable trust. We know that was upset when Kennedy was killed. That never came back online. We know that Sakharov was definitely somebody who his heart beat to that drum. He definitely had that orientation. And unfortunately, he died too soon before he could begin to really make policy in Russia. You know, he was a parliamentarian at a very hopeful time. But his death and a lot of sabotage prevented that type of positive discussion from happening. I know, Ed, that you were part of that too, discussions for real economic, major 10, 20-year infrastructure projects that would have really revived and given new economic life and hope to the East and West relations in 1989-90. On top of security guarantees, all of that was lit on fire. So we're now at a place where I think the world is very different from the one which certain people thought was unfolding in, you know, let's say back in the Obama era.
That's correct.
It was looking like the world was going to become one thing. Then there was, you know, Putin put his basically said no to regime change in Syria. There's finally a serious resistance to that orientation of regime change, lighting the Arab worlds on fire. And that began to, as I mentioned, tie very closely into the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. And it has just been manifesting in creative ways all over Africa, South America, and beyond. And there's open offers, even today, to get Western countries that don't want to collapse in the oncoming economic meltdown. And I'm quite persuaded, looking at what's holding our Western economic system together, it's bubblegum and illusions. There's an impending blowout of the financial system. That's only a question of when, not if it's going to happen. And if we want to survive, we could accept their offers to start building real things again like we used to and save ourselves. But if we don't, I mean, like I said, it's really holding on to the Titanic as it's going down, and the rest of the world wants to survive.
Thank you, Matt. You brought some economic points, important economic points. I don't know if someone in Washington is listening to that. They still, Blinken just yesterday, he continued to push this unipolar system and the US hegemony. So I don't know if anyone in Washington is, or in Congress, the only one which I can name is Senator Rand Paul, 1 out of 100, unless you can mention some other names. So 1 out of 100, it's not very impressive number. Let's go back to Europe. I think that Alex, what country is now? It's Alex Krainer. What country you will be speaking to us?
I'm Croatian, but I'll be speaking to you from Monaco.
From where? Ah, Monaco. Ah, okay.
Yeah, that's right. That's
okay.
right.
Alex, okay, go ahead.
Hello.
Well, so thank you for including me. Basically, I just wanted to point out the organizing principle of everything that's going on, because as Matthew just said, there's a degree of insanity to the behavior of the West, but obviously people in charge, I'm not talking at the puppet level, I'm talking at the higher level. They're not insane. There's a rhyme and reason for the way they're running things, and there are objectives that they are trying to attain. And so I think it all goes back to the Western empires, call it American, call it British, whatever. Their overarching imperative is to maintain hegemony over the Eurasian landmass, for the simple reason that that's where the bulk of the global GDP and population and trade and wealth is. So I think that that's the overarching objective. I think that the logic of empire excludes cooperation with rivals. It only seeks to dominate. It doesn't do equitable deals on a fair basis. So it's not interested in cooperation with Russia. It's not interested in cooperation in Syria. It's interested in eliminating rivals. So that's why the policy is bipartisan, because it's not like the Republicans are going to be, let's go kill Russia, and the Democrats are going to say, no, let's go cooperate for everybody's greater benefit. The policy objectives come from a higher level, and they go to the Democrats and to the Republican as marching orders. So it's only the question of pretext. They will create a pretext one way or another. They will not reverse course. They will not wake up one day and say like, this is not working. Maybe we should cooperate with Russia and China. That's not going to happen. So I think that the Russian strategy of holding firm now and finally getting tough is probably a well-chosen moment, because I think that they are perceiving weakness and discord in the West. So by going tough, they're going to put pressure on those discords, because there's neocons like the Kagans, like Victoria Nuland and everybody associated with their school of thought, who want to go to war, who want to push all of our children to become cannon fodder. But then there's other people who maybe have cooler heads and who have other visions. So by going tough and setting up this quote unquote ultimatum, I think it was a calculated moment to maybe exacerbate those divisions and those cracks in thinking, and because obviously, neither the NATO nor the United States are a monolith, so you're kind of forcing the toughest element that you're opposed to into the limelight. And then, lastly, I just wanted to also point out the level of order givers above the puppets is the banking cartel, because the Western banking system is absolutely starved, desperate for collateral. It doesn't work unless it can pile on, unless it can grow and continue to metastasize. But to do that, it needs collateral, which means resources, which means cheap labor, which means export markets and so forth. Obviously, the Eurasian landmass is where most of the healthy collateral is, particularly Russia, because Russia is still, unlike the Western financial system, which is in debt to the tune of 300% of the GDP. Russians' debt to GDP ratio last time I looked was something like 16%. Maybe it's gone a bit higher since then, but obviously Russia can run the credit creation cycle far further. And obviously from the Western financial institutions' point of view, they would much rather control that than leaving it to the Russians to control it. So I think to conclude, the organizing principle of Western policymaking and Western conduct of in this crisis is the banking cartel, and their objective is clearly to take over, not to eliminate the rivals, and not in any sense to cooperate and try to build a healthy economy for everybody else.
Thank you, Alex. I think our discussion is very good, because we're touching on security, nuclear security, economy, finance. So we're covering, I think, the whole spectrum. Now back to the States, Jeremy Kuzmarov from Oklahoma. Your turn.
I think a lot has been covered, so I think points have been very good that have been made, and I think Alex makes a good point that it does seem to be irrational, completely reckless, but there are certain hidden agendas or powerful interests at play that are driving this policy and this confrontation. And I mean, I think we could also look domestically, as far as U.S. politics, the military-industrial complex and its hold over the United States political structure, and with the decline of the war on terror, they need a new enemy, and Russia is very convenient as that enemy, either Russia or China, and that's the way to mobilize public opinion, by demonizing Russia and China ceaselessly. To sustain, because the Biden military budget, well, Congress pushed even higher. Biden was requesting an increase over Trump, whose budget had been very, very high, and then Congress raised the ante even more, and it's likely Biden will sign off on that. So I mean, they need to play up the Russian threat, and as you mentioned, they won't allow Peter or anyone with our viewpoint, or really a objective viewpoint, onto the U.S. media, because they've been able to control the media. Ray McGovern, we had a piece in a Covert Action Magazine profiling Ray McGovern, the man who got Russiagate right. And, he'd been completely silenced. He was, 27-year CIA veteran who used to brief George H.W. Bush, and they just silenced him, and he called it the military industrial congressional intelligence academic think tank complex. And I think that is a shift. I mean, in an earlier generation, like in the 80s, there was at least some debate and some, I think, opportunity for, if you were saying you were in the US media in the 80s, that has changed, and that is because the growing stronghold of this military industry and military complex, and basically taking over the United States, all sectors. And yeah, Congress, I mean, there used to be some more dovish people in the Congress, like a George McGovern, even could challenge for the presidency. And you no longer have such people. Yeah, and even the progressives in the Democratic Party are terrible. Like, Bernie Sanders is supposed to be leading a revolution, and look at his positions on Russia and NATO. They're not very progressive at all. He rarely speaks out on these issues. And Ocasio-Cortez is supposed to be this radical revolutionary, but I think she voted for the NATO expansion, and
That is correct.
so these guys are not very good at all. No, this is really the key, because if you want to cut the military budget, you really got to challenge the rhetoric narrative about Russia and China, and they're not doing that. Yeah, the only one is Rand Paul, one person, the whole U.S. Congress. And yeah, and the media is just complete blackout of anybody with a progressive outlook or even realistic outlook. And that's, growing authoritarianism, accompanying what Alex is discussing, this growing financial crisis and, power of the banking cartel, as well as military complex, and it's destroying, functional democracy and precluding any debate on these issues in the mainstream. So, and I think academia has become an adjunct to the media, and they're not, you have very few mainstream academics in the elite universities who are promoting a progressive outlook, and Peter may be the exception, and he's been in his position for a long time. Younger faculty will not get hired with his outlook
That is
anymore.
correct.
And that's a big shift, and it exemplifies, this authoritarianism, which is needed to carry forward these kind of policies that are beneficial to the 1% and very, very dangerous.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. By the way, just I think yesterday the poll came about American people's attitude to all what's going on. Not just experts, regular folks, and it says that about 3/4 of Americans believe that we should stay away from those Ukrainian crisis and concentrate on domestic. Still, 1/4 of Americans believe that that America should go to war. It's a substantial number. I mean, 25%, 27%. Well, of course, if someone probably follow up with a question, are you ready to send your sons?
Exactly.
Then maybe this number will be reduced, but still 3/4 probably share close to our opinion. Now back to Virginia. Jim is now retiring in the Virginia farm. How is it going in Virginia?
Meeting a lot of the locals here, been here for 9 generations. I think we're pretty much hunkered down for whatever comes.
Where in Virginia are you?
I'm not going to say. Let's just say I'm in rural Virginia. How's that?
Well, Google will find you.
Near some of the bloodiest ground in the country. But before I proceed, as a notoriously binary cisgender person, I want to usurp your authority as the chairman of this meeting and insist that the lady go first.
Okay, very good. I thought that this will be nice to conclude from hear voice from Ukraine, but I think you're probably right. So, Mila, it's your turn.
My turn?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot. What I can say the main problem is a perception of a threat. You see that NATO, they perceive Russia as a threat, and the same do NATO. Like they also the same. So the self-perception is the main problem, and there are several views on this situation about this ultimatum. The first one, it is the growing ambitions of Russia, like new empire or the rising power of Russia. The second, it's like any the other people think that it's maybe the imperialism of NATO also, the rising ambitious and aggressive policy of NATO. There's also such kind of perception in the world. Not all people, they support NATO in their policy, and they can't understand the reason of this enlargement. Why? For what? Because, and the third is NATO effective? Because it seems it's an effective organization that has a lot of problems also, not only terrorism, Iran, Afghanistan, so many problems, and they are trying to provocate Ukraine because we understand that Ukraine will be never a member of NATO. But it's kind of provocation for Russia. For what purpose? For what reason they play such strange game? Yeah, just making and increasing the problem in European security region. That looks strange for people, and also in Ukraine. You see that we need to make, due to the Minsk agreement, we need to make some changes to our constitution. But we didn't do this. Instead of this, we made some changes like promoting that the NATO is our strategic goal and we want to join NATO. We need, look, that's strange. We need to make changes in constitution for Donbas people, not for join NATO, but nothing done. That means that Ukraine choose not its self-interest, like because it have a window to settle this conflict with Russia, yeah, just like in the framework of Minsk, but we are trying to play a game with US and NATO. So there is no common understanding of the situation in Ukraine. Maybe I can say that half people, they don't support joining NATO at all. There is no common position in our government and also in our community. But Zelensky in 2020, he made a strategic document saying that NATO is our goal. What I can say also, the main problem is not joining NATO, but the instrument of NATO of transforming the countries. Like they have some kinds of lobbying groups, some instruments to transform the country who wants to join the NATO, and they put some tools and ask to reform different fields. And it looks for Russia as interfering into internal policy, yeah? So it looks like NATO undermine the sovereignty of different countries. They don't protect your sovereignty, but they just say what you need and should to do in order to join NATO, like this action plan and so on. So my country is struggling from corruption, bad governments, internal crisis, war with Russia, and there is no any guarantees from NATO. If Russia will interfere, what happened? Nothing. They will not protect us. You see, that's the main problem. There is no any guarantees for Ukraine at all. So we're just playing in a very dirty game. I can say this. And what I propose, I think that's not only the problem of Russia. It is a time to reform international security. It is time to say that West and Western system of European security is ineffective. And maybe it is time to build a new collective security, not NATO, not pro-Russian, but a neutral one, like to make a buffer zone between NATO and Russia, just to protect other countries, because there is the same situation with Balkans. It's not only with Ukraine, yeah. The same can be happened with Serbia. You know that they are trying to take Serbia in NATO, and people, they don't support this. So it is a common situation, and I think that's a good chance for international system to start thinking about reforming. And I don't think that's about confrontation, because Russia and US, they established working groups on strategic stability. And also NATO proposed Russia to reestablish NATO-Russia Council. And it's just about the format of interacting with Russia. And there is a new window and new opportunity to build something new. So that's why, and also the last, I don't think that Russia will send troops to Ukraine, but they easily can recognize Donetsk National Republic and can easily recognize Lugansk National Republic just without sending troops. And Western countries, they don't have anything to respond. That's all.
Thank you. Well, voice of reason from Kyiv. It's my birthplace. Thank you, Mila. And by the way, she is speaking not just as an ordinary citizen, she is advisor to Ukrainian parliament. So it was so refreshing to hear some voices like this, like Mila's from Kyiv. Now, Jim, since you are the only one from this group who worked for US government in senior positions, so you are to blame. And now it's responsibility somehow to explain us what we should do.
Mea culpa, mea maximo culpa. Yes, it's all my fault. Well, look, I hate to, oh, excuse me. Yes, I'm on. I hate to spoil the giddy optimism of the speakers up to now in terms of how there are bright rays of sunshine that we could be looking for here, because I don't see them. I think what we're going to see next is pretty much baked into the cake, that things are going to be happening on the macro level. And I'm glad some of the other speakers mentioned things like the financial system. Peter mentioned Iran. We were talking about China, the Taiwan Strait, and so forth, that the world order that has been built up over the last few decades is a house of cards, and something's going to crack. And that crack is going to be not just international, but I think also domestically in terms of the American economy, status of the dollar. Look at the condition of our country now. We've been talking about a kind of cold civil war for several years now, in terms of woke ideology from the corporations and the government, or whether it's the vax policy and lockdowns or CRT and all sorts of other things, that there are so many weak links here. Something's going to break somewhere. We don't know what that is. Right now, at the top of the agenda, this seems to be Ukraine and NATO. But let's be clear. We keep talking about Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. Ukraine is the tip of the spear, but the bigger problem has been the expansion of NATO, the inexorable expansion of NATO. Every country has a right to join NATO, but evidently countries like, say, Montenegro did not have a right not to join NATO because most people there did not want to, but they had to join it anyway. In terms of the notion that Glenn raised, that we're now talking about European security, no, I don't think we are yet talking about European security. From Putin's speech today, where he said, we are not interested in negotiations. We want security guarantees. That you are on our borders, we are not on your borders. Do you not understand this? And the short answer is no, they do not understand this. That I don't think proposals from the United States, which is really the only country that matters right now. I think there are people like William Burns who do understand what is going on, but there are very few of them. They're going to come back and try to game it. They're going to come back and say, well, we cannot reject the notion of NATO expansion, but we can talk about a pause. Or, well, we cannot reject the notion of NATO deployments in the areas around Russia's borders and littoral, but we can talk about confidence building measures and maybe enhanced notifications, things of this sort, and to try to bog down Russia into negotiations of that sort. maybe the Russians will fall for that, but I think all the signals that they're sending now are that they will not fall for that. And indeed, I have to wonder when the Russians ask for security guarantees and even a treaty, what good is that to have a security guarantee from people who simply cannot be trusted? I think the idea that NATO or the United States would renounce the right of every country to join NATO, or the notion that NATO is the dominant security organization in Europe, is about as useless as asking Bolsheviks in the 1920s to reject proletarian internationalism and the labor theory of value. They just, presuppositions are just not amenable to any kind of rational discussion. And as was pointed out by someone with regard to, I think it was maybe Peter, with regard to the Russian reaction of just Biden talking to Putin, there is simply no room for any voice of sanity to make any kind of minimal step in the right direction, because he'll be immediately set upon and torn apart by the rest of the establishment. So I just don't see where this is going. I think the one question that we really haven't asked is something that Matt's countryman, Patrick Armstrong, raised in a recent piece, which is, what is the or else coming from Moscow? Putin has said this is not an ultimatum, but it's, okay, let's call it a non-ultimatum. It's kind of a quasi-ultimatum. Behind every ultimatum or ultimatum-ish is a what else? What comes after that? When, as I think is virtually certain, the demands are not met in any reasonable way, what do you do next? And he gave a very good list of countermeasures, counter threats, I think Mr. Rybakov has called them, that Russia can take. Yes, I think Mila is right, recognizing the Donetsk and Lugansk republics would be one of those. One of the suggestions that Patrick made is, well, maybe Russia could use standoff weapons and special forces to destroy the Azov Battalion. That would be a very good gesture, in my opinion. There are other things they could do in terms of deploying advanced weapons in areas that would directly threaten NATO territory. Maybe put them in Kaliningrad. Name a list of NATO capitals that would be directly announced as targets in the events of any hostility. There are many things they could do to fundamentally change the security situation in Europe. But again, looking at the larger picture, that if we look at the United States as Oceania, as the big thalassic power, that there's got to be some major shift in the international system against Oceania and in favor of East Asia and Eurasia. At least in the fairly near future, I think that's going to happen. I think it's going to be very dramatic and will have huge consequences domestically in the United States as well as in other countries. I think this is all, as I say, baked into the cake. I gave a talk at the Ron Paul Institute in September called "It's Later Than You Think." And I think it is later than we think. I think that people of goodwill and sound judgment can have discussions like this, but nobody's going to listen to us who's actually going to be making any decisions, at least on the Western side of the ledger. All the wrong people are there, with very, very few exceptions. They are, as I say, going to try to game it. I don't think that's going to work. I don't think the Russians are going to fall for that this time. Something's going to happen. As far as the role of religion, getting back to where Edward started this, Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev recently met with Pope Francis. Apparently, they're trying to set up a meeting between Pope Francis and Patriarch Kirill. Frankly, I don't see much coming from that. Let's keep in mind that Washington has already weaponized religion, particularly in Ukraine, with respect to the Orthodox Church. I think the best thing religious people could do is go back and pray somewhere, because I think that's about the only thing that could make any difference at this point.
Well, we started on optimistic note and now with pessimistic, but we still have a couple of weeks. And yesterday I was on Ukrainian TV and they asked me the same question, what do you expect? So I told them, well, listen, it's Christmas time, so definitely a war will not start until Russian Orthodox Christmas and New Year, which is January 13. So we have at least until January 13 the time to maybe think about this, write something. And I know, Matt, since you are senior fellow at the American University of Moscow, maybe Matt will come up with some kind of a summary, or Martin. He's also, so two of my employees. I mean, they work for me, I don't pay them, but still.
You are an honest man.
They have this great title of senior fellow, because it connects America and Russia. It's American University in Moscow, right? So we are the bridge.
Yeah, I'm doing it all for that title. Let's create a business card.
So maybe
Canada is the bridge. Canada is the bridge.
All right. So maybe we'll come up with some statement we'll send to all of you. You'll make your edits and all that. And then, of course, we'll have this Washington Times. It's now like in the Soviet Union, it was Pravda who was main newspaper. Now I vote for Washington Times because it's the only paper which allows me to print my what you call dissident views. So anyway, anyone wants to add something? And because I know it's Christmas Day, you're getting ready for celebrations and services and all that. So we still have a few minutes. Maybe anyone wants to
Alex.
Yeah, I just wanted to all the same pull the discussion onto the optimistic side, because as I read Russian policymaking over the last 10-15 years, I find Russian policy extraordinarily sophisticated and forward-looking, and I think that they will not strike at Ukraine for one very simple reason. You know, it's a divided society. There are people in Ukraine who want to cooperate with Russia, who don't want to join NATO, and so forth. If you took a hostile act against Ukraine in any sense that violated Ukraine's sovereignty, you know, apart from Crimea, but Donbas region or an invasion, what happens in society is that instantly the opinion polarizes, everybody closes ranks behind the leadership, whether you like them or not, and the stances harden against the invader. I think that Russia will not waste this opportunity to empower people who are favorable to Russia in Ukraine, and to disempower those who would like to fight and join NATO. So if they were dumb, they would attack Ukraine, but I don't think they're dumb. So I don't think we're going to see war in this cycle.
What about provocation? What if Ukrainian forces will attack Donbas?
I would expect that they're prepared for this. You know, we've seen how Russia reacted to provocation when a Russian airliner was shot down in Egypt, when a Russian jet plane was shot down in Turkey, when a whole 8 or 9 Russian diplomats have been assassinated in 2014, 2015. Russia simply did not take the bait. And so I don't think they're going to take the bait this time around either.
I don't know. Mila, what do you think?
I think that the best position for Putin is to recognize Donetsk National Republic and Lugansk National Republic as a part of Russia, because Ukraine is not ready for a big war with Russia. It will be just the same case as it was with Crimea. Nobody will go to war with Russia. So they just will recognize it without sending any troops. And for European countries and for Ukraine, it will be a big problem what to do next. Okay, they will recognize because they are in this region already. They don't need to send troops. There is some even Russian legislation and so on. And people of this territory, they asked for several times Putin to recognize them. So that's one position. The second position, US needs Russia. They need Russia in Iran, in Afghanistan, in several questions. So they will try to make some kind of partnership or a new format. I don't believe in a confrontation between US and Russia. So it seems like Ukraine, it's over. The situation is Ukraine over. Just we are losers and that's all.
Well, maybe it's like a repeat of a Georgian scenario when Russia recognized South Ossetia and Abkhazia.
Yes.
And but then, of course, has to be some kind of a agreement between Russia and those two new states. And this will be like, so repeat. And then Saakashvili, remember what ended up, he's now in a Georgian jail. So maybe, by the way, Poroshenko is now done. So maybe for the current president, it's maybe time to rethink what he's doing before it's too late. Anyone else wants to? Peter?
Yeah, well,
Peter, did you raise your hand? Yeah, go ahead.
Peter, you're on mute.
I just said I've got to run, but it's a very interesting discussion. I'm glad to see everybody, and I look forward to the recording.
Here, here.
Bye, everybody.
Very good.
Bye, Peter.
Matt, you said one sentence.
I did, but I know Glenn didn't speak very much, and I saw your hand raised. Glenn, did you want to say something, or?
Oh no, I just said bye.
Oh, okay, I misdiagnosed that. Sorry. Yeah, no, I mean, I just wanted to quickly just chime in briefly regarding, because it is a bit of mental gymnastics sometimes to get into the mindset of an actual manager of this dying rules-based order in the West. Like, how are they thinking? And I mean, I try to vicariously put myself in the shoes of somebody in an upper level decision-making position who is, let's say, the type of individuals planning the Democracy Summit, or the current insane maneuvers going on Russia's perimeter or China's perimeter around in the Pacific. And obviously, there's a certain recognition that a big chunk of the world is not going to abide by the rules of this this new order that they want to bring online after the current system is reset, which might sound really nice in an ivory tower sort of way when you're at a blackboard, detached from reality.
Exactly.
It might, yeah, okay. But then there's this reality thing that mathematicians, people who try to impose mathematical logic onto human systems, they don't get that. They don't know how to, they have a problem with this discrepancy. And so now that we actually have more, the majority, I'd say, of the world's population and major nations are not abiding by this formula for what this reset system is going to look like. It seems like there's this desperate effort to try to go for the Orwell, 1984 Eurasia versus, what was it? Oceania versus Eurasia versus East Asia. I think that they're trying to just find excuses to maximize the fissures that exist, to break all sorts of lines of communication, trade, everything from the countries that they cannot currently control. And they kind of want, it's like they're spitting in the face of Russia and China in Taiwan, in Ukraine, almost to try to provoke them to bite the bait, to jump and actually do something violent, which I'm completely impressed by both China and Russia's approach to just not fall for debate, as Alex has made the point. They just never fall for the bait. But I think that there's this idea that that it's possible to just force this new Iron Curtain to come down, try to focus on cultural warfare, if possible, to play a longer term game, to try to subvert the youth in Russia, in China, and other countries over the longer term, and maybe come back and win the day in a few decades or something, while focusing on consolidating their very dystopic vision for what the world should be in the West, where the NATO cage is more firmly set in place. I understand, Jim, why you made the decision to, to make a move. And there's, I think overall they have lost though, and it might get, I think, ugly in the Western order here, where a lot of us are based. It's something new in my experience, and I think all of our experience. But I think that overall the game has been lost when I look at the quality of thinking and the type of ideas that are emanating out of the new operating system of Russia, China, other countries. 140 countries are increasingly on board with that completely different paradigm. It actually is, it's fit to survive. Like it actually has creativity built into it in a serious way, and it could be sabotaged. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I don't see the current wannabe gods of Olympus trying to manage our system here able to subvert that in the short term, and hopefully not in the long term either. But yeah,
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, Matt. Yes, Glenn.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add very quickly that many people have been using words like salami tactics, focusing on how US has broken a lot of it previous agreement, and I also think this is one of the reasons why there's reason for being pessimistic about these talks, because it seems from the onset that the purpose of proposing any agreements or sitting down having a dialogue with Russia, the main purpose seems to be simply to make Russia well, not disarm, but reduce tensions, while the US would gradually change realities on the ground. And again, this is one of the key problems of what's happened in Ukraine as well, because openly the US claims it's completely supports the Minsk agreement, but at the same time it refuses to actually push Kyiv to implement the Minsk agreement. Instead, they put these crushing sanctions on Russia while pushing weapons into Ukraine, and then trying to gradually overturn, undermine the whole foundation of the Minsk agreement, and gradually begin to put the realities on the ground for NATO expansion in de facto form or actual expansion. So I think this is the main problem, that there's no belief anymore that such negotiations has any purpose. It was previously mentioned the JCPOA in Iran, but also you have with China, they have the perception that the US is chipping away at the one China policy, and of course Russia has its own experience from withdrawal of the ABM treaty to the INF and the Russian NATO founding act of 1997. None of these agreements actually mean anything. It's seen as being an instrument to make the Russians more compliant and nod and feel everything's okay, while reality is being changed on the ground. I mean, nothing that's happened from Romania to Poland or all the spaces. None of it conforms with existing agreements, and even pan-European security agreements are now rejected under the notion that countries should have this freedom to join NATO. So it's I don't know. I see it's very pessimistic. That's why I kind of agree with the previous comment that I don't think Russia's that interested in discussing this if it's simply a distraction, if it's not authentic. So that's the only thing I wanted to add.
I have one more thing.
Okay, Martin. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Ed. I think Mila was focusing very specifically on the Ukraine issue, and Matt was giving an overview of the general confusion in Washington from the outside. I thought both assessments were absolutely brilliant, but more than that, they connect together because the United States and NATO and the right-wing Trotskyites, and a remarkable number of them are actually children of fellow neocons and neoliberals who started out as literal Trotskyites of the left, became literal Trotskyites of the right. And when you listen to them speak informally, off the record, or in question and answer sessions, they're very explicit often about this. They really believe that chaos is good. They like ambiguity and they like chaos. And this is what they created in Ukraine in 2014. And this is where they think they flourish. I see Mila understands this at first hand completely well. So Mila's recommendation to Moscow about formalizing very firmly and clearly, as was done in Crimea. I mean, for all the grumbling in the West about Crimea, there is no instability in Crimea. Crimea is stably part of the Russian Federation, and the West knows this, and they do not dare destabilize it. I think the same action needs to be taken in those two key areas of Ukraine, whose overwhelming populations have made very clear consistently over the past 7 years where they want to be. because we are dealing with people who thrive, in the short term at least, on chaos. And this comes back to Matt's point too. Now I see Jim nodding his head. Jim and I and Peter and you, Ed, we live in Washington. We have fun. Oh, you did, Jim. We all have functioned in here. And we understand the mindset of these people from the inside. And I don't know how you managed it, Mila, but clearly I can see on your face, you understand this mindset very well too. It is a chaotic mindset, not just a mad mindset, which I think it clinically is, but it is also a chaotic mindset. And it has several different kinds of fugue states, different mythological aspects which have no empirical foundation in reality, observed reality or facts whatsoever, and even contradict with each other philosophically, but they entertain these conflicting views at the same time. It's no coincidence that Emerson was an American who said that a mark of a first-rate mind was to hold conflicting views simultaneously. Well, I think that was certainly true for Emerson, but I don't think it's true. It's wise always for dealing with the world. But that's what we're dealing with here. In Washington, you have a lot of different sleepwalkers whose one guiding principle is the propagation of chaos, which they imagine is a good thing, and that the dice will always roll sixes for them. That if you create chaos, it will automatically work out for them. They believe Adam Smith, that zero government or minimum government always works well. Now, this flies in the face of all human experience through history. It's quite wicked, and it's incredibly stupid, and it's even mad. But it is the prevailing view in Washington. And you can only understand the lack of policy in Washington, the lack of consistency, and the nature of the chaotic suicidal adventures they jump on, if you realize how on both left and right, this is ingrained deeply in their DNA and in the marrow of their bones.
Can I just shortly say? I just want to say this because you said that it was my recommendation. I don't live in a free country. I can easily go to jail. It's not a recommendation, it's prediction. Because if I recommend something like this to Russia, I will go to jail. I need to just to support Ukraine territory and integrity. Yeah, so it's just a prediction based on the several steps made by Putin. The first one, he gave passports, Russian passports, to the citizens of this territory. The second, he made also some steps in financial system. So, and also he made some steps with some economic issues. And they are tied. They are tied of Minsk. They are tied of this game in Minsk because Ukraine, they don't want to do some essential steps to take the obligation. So they just want to end this game and to recognize the territory. And that's all. That will be an end of this confrontation between US and Russia.
Yeah, definitely we have to applaud Mila. We are still kind of live in a free country. But Mila, of course, she's right, and we have to protect her. We don't hear too many sane voices coming from Ukraine. Okay, well, it's not good to end on a pessimistic note, but we have to face reality.
Yes.
Again,
one more comment about that.
Nothing horrible will happen until January 13th. So I want to wish Merry Christmas.
Wait, Ed, Jim is jumping out of his skin.
Okay.
One last thing. You can always edit me out later if you want to. I want to just pick up briefly on what Marty said about the empire of chaos here. Yeah, the off-ramp has always been here. The path of reason has always been here. But I agree that the kind of people we have there are just not the types to take it. What they do like to do is go back to tried and true. If they're trying to extend and perpetuate the empire of chaos, do something chaotic. Yes. Shoigu, as Marty mentioned, already mentioned the possibility of a chemical false flag. Let's look at the big picture here again. Let's suppose you say, all right, suppose we provoke, our side provokes something very bad happening in Ukraine. Exactly. And then the Russians do something predictable like move into Ukraine, dismantle the country. They've already said that that's the end of the Ukrainian state. We've already seen articles saying that they're already preparing scenarios for supporting guerrilla warfare in Ukraine. How is that a loss for the West if that happens? Because if we look at the original mission of NATO, Russians out, Americans in, Germans or writ large Europeans down, that would put any possible rapprochement between Russia and Europe into the deep freeze permanently, turn most of Europe into a permanent Washington dependency, and make Russia a permanent pariah. How is that a loss for the kind of people we see in Washington? I think would be a big win for them. I think we have to be very vigilant, not that now we can do anything about it, but I think there's a very strong possibility that some kind of provocative measure will be taken by the Western side.
Oh boy. Yeah. It's well, the only thing we can do, we can say it openly, and now, and publicize it. So Matt
and pray.
All right. Yeah, and don't forget to add rabbis into prayer.
I don't know how to do that.
But maybe Blinken and Zelensky, maybe in Victor and Nuland, they know. Well, again, it's thank you so much for joining. I think it was very interesting. Now, Matt and Marty, it's your responsibility to to prepare some kind of doesn't have to be too long, maybe 2-3 pages, and to then send it to all of us. We'll make our edits, and then everyone is free to add or not to add his or her signature, and I'll try to publicize it the best way. And all of you, of course, everyone has his own list, and it's the only thing we can do. So Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, and to Russians and Ukrainians, their Christmas is on January 7, and Orthodox New Year is January 13. So maybe we'll meet again after January 13 if we are still in one piece, and continue this discussion. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.